G'day, I'm Dr. Carl, University of Sydney, Shirtloads of Science, and here I'm with Dr. Brooke Nickel, and you've done some interesting research looking at things that people find on social media that might not be true. Is that true? Okay, so you've written some papers here which will give people an idea. One of them is called Social Media Promotion of Health Tests with Potential for Overdiagnosis or Overuse. And the other paper is called Social Media Posts about Medical Tests with Potential for Overdiagnosis. Well, surely diagnosing what's wrong with you is empowering. How can it possibly go wrong? So give me the background, please, Dr. Brooke.
Yeah, so my background is in public health.
Yep.
I did a master's in public health here at the University of Sydney and also my PhD in the School of Public Health. And I've always looked at the issue of overdiagnosis. I've looked mostly in cancer, which has the best evidence for overdiagnosis, but increasingly we're becoming aware of other conditions and issues that can lead to overdiagnosis.
Now, would there have been like a certain famous social media person that sort of stimulated you into activity down this pathway, or there was like a high point or a marker for you?
Yeah, so it may be a little bit ashamed to say it, but Kim Kardashian's post a few years ago that went viral on full-body MRI scans.
Full body, okay, so it's like an X-ray, but it can show more detail, and you're doing the whole body from tip to toe. Okay, yeah. So what did she say?
So she called the scans life-saving, and that they can find, conditions such as cancer in its earliest form, which is not a lie, but when being promoted to the public and healthy individuals, full-body MRI scans have no evidence of benefit and can actually lead to harm from things like incidentalomas.
Right. When you say life-saving, surely it saved her own personal life?
No, she was talking about friends, I believe, in the post, or family members. So
Friends, so that sort of fits into the anecdote. So it saved the life of a friend, she kind of implied. And was there any hint of personal benefit that she would get from saying this thing on social media?
well, in her post, she said that it was not an ad, but she used a company's name and was sitting in front of a full-body MRI scan that the company uses to tell everyone to go and get these if they can.
Wow, it's like saying, I'm not saying go get a fizzy drink, but boy, do I like Coca-Cola, glug, 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 glug. This is not an ad. Oh my God. Okay, so she said get an MRI scan, and so I've looked at your papers here, and so you look at 5 major diagnostic tests.
All of the 5 tests we looked at in our study lack evidence of overall benefit for healthy individuals and could lead to harm. Particularly, we were interested in the harm of overdiagnosis. Overdiagnosis is a diagnosis of a condition that wouldn't have caused symptoms or problems in a person's lifetime should it have not been detected, and can lead to more harm than good. This includes psychological impacts from receiving the diagnosis and unnecessary treatments which can have both side effects and also costs to both the individual and the healthcare system.
What was the first test?
The first test was this full-body MRI scan.
Right. Well, surely being empowered and knowing you've got something wrong with you can only be good.
Well, that's kind of how it's being marketed or discussed on social media, and it claims to find up to 500 different conditions in their earliest forms.
But there's all sorts of things that you find that will never affect you. So, for example, most men have cancer of the prostate, but it won't kill them. They'll die of something else. Okay, so that looks at the whole body, and they find things that may or may not be useful. We'll talk about the benefits and harm of that later. What was the second test?
The second one was the multi-cancer early detection test. So this is a blood liquid biopsy test that looks for circulating tumor DNA in your bloodstream. So it kind of picks up markers for different cancers and has a different kind of prediction on whether or not you might then go on to develop those.
Do you need just like a spot of blood from a fingertip prick, or do you need like a couple of mils or something?
Yeah, I think it's more that like a blood draw, like that one you have to go in
to a clinic and
go through your doctor. But it's being heavily promoted in the US and the UK as the holy grail of cancer detection, and claiming it to find up to 50 different cancers in their earliest forms. And there's been a few studies looking at this with kind of mixed results across different cancers, but there is a clinical trial now happening in the UK, and some of the early findings from that trial aren't as promising as it's being made out to be. And so the evidence for what they're claiming it can do is just still really early, and the science behind it might just not be there yet.
Would it have a use, like for example, you've been diagnosed with a specific cancer, and then they're giving you a treatment, and you want to follow along, and does it work in that case? Does it give you a hint of how the cancer's being pushed back?
Exactly. I think that's what liquid biopsies in cancer came about, for people who were in remission, to kind of monitor and track whether or not they had any of kind of this existing DNA in their bloodstream from their previous cancers. But now it's being looked at on a population level, so similar to that of a screening test.
Ah, so it's not really a screening test, and you can get all sorts of, as with all tests, including MRIs, false positives and false negatives. So it says that you got something when you don't, or it says that you don't have something when you do. And that can lead you into a position of false security or false worry.
Absolutely. You can go both ways, and the sensitivity and the specificity of the test really varies across the different cancers that it's looking at. And like I said, there's just no strong evidence to show that on a population level the benefits do then outweigh the harms.
Okay, so that's two. What was the third test that has been promoted as something you should do on this social media?
So it's the anti-Müllerian hormone test, also known as the AMH test or the egg timer test.
The egg timer, like a chicken egg, except you're talking about an egg from a human female in the ovary. So tell us about that.
So that test is being discussed and promoted as a way for women to understand their fertility potential. So looking at the number of eggs or the quantity of eggs left in their ovary instead of kind of the quality. And we know that women really only need one good egg to get pregnant with a healthy baby. So it kind of gives you this indication of how many eggs you have left, and then, whether or not you might need to think about IVF treatments or freezing your eggs, or, planning in the future. And it just doesn't have any evidence to show that it actually can predict the chance of a healthy individual conceiving, or the chance of beginning menopause, which it claims to do.
Really? So my understanding is that over whatever it is, 20, 30, whatever, 40 years of life, when a woman is delivering eggs at one a month, maybe there's 400 eggs that come out, but there are many hundreds of thousands present at birth, and the number drops with time. And is it like do they get an armful of blood, a syringe, or is it a finger prick test? Or
So I think it can be done both ways, but more and more we're now seeing it being sold direct to consumers. So you can order the little box online, and you can do a fingerprint test and send that blood back to a lab to then be able to analyze and tell you kind of a range in which your eggs might be in.
Well, you mentioned the word range, so let's get back to that in a second. But so firstly, you don't have to inject yourself with something and stimulate the eggs to say, hello, here I am, but rather, depending on how many eggs there are, not the quality of them, but the number, there will be a certain level of this hormone. But then the range can vary enormously from person to person. And you say that they're using this to predict when the timing of menopause might be, or something?
Yeah. That's also one of the claims there as well. And we know from studies that women who get a low AMH versus a normal versus a high, that they all kind of have the same outcomes in the end. It doesn't change whether or not they do indeed have a healthy baby, or when the prediction of their menopause.
Wow. Okay, so that's the third test, and then the fourth one?
The fourth one we looked at was the gut microbiome test. And so this is really a stool test that, again, can be done at home or in a doctor's office.
Yep.
And you basically send that sample to the lab, and they analyze it for the different microbiomes that are in your gut, and tell you different potential conditions or issues that you might have with, food sensitivity, but also underlying conditions, that might be claiming to cause depression.
So you get the stool sample and you put in a plastic bag and you send off to the lab. And what happens? Do you then get something that somebody takes you through and interprets this incredibly complex thing with you?
They send it directly back to you. So
What?
it arrives on your phone or on your computer, or in the mail. And, from my understanding, it can be pages and pages of results that are very hard to interpret. Often on the posts, we could see people actually scrolling through the results and, interpreting them in many different ways. But I guess you could take it to a doctor, but it's just sent back usually directly to yourself.
But we don't really know what they do. Like, we do know that, in my particular case, I've got 37 trillion cells that came from my parents when they loved each other very much in a special way. And also I've got 40 trillion, a bit more, of bacteria that are much smaller, so they only weigh a couple of 100 grams, mostly in my gut, but all over the place. And in my gut, they are essential for providing me with nutrition. So if I didn't have them, I'd weigh 2/3 my weight, and I'd be weak and sickly, and be eating 2 breakfasts, 2 lunches, and 2 dinners, and my brain wouldn't be fully developed because those gut bacteria wouldn't have made, if they hadn't been there, the essential free fatty acids for my brain development. So we definitely need these guys, but they're so variable from person to person. They interact in all sorts of complex ways, and we haven't even begun to work that out. And I'm kind of guessing that they would say you've got, Firmicutes bacteria, and the normal range is such and such, and your range should be higher or lower.
Yeah, it gives you kind of like a scale on where you sit and where it should be at. And I think, like you said, I think there is really good science to say how important gut microbiome is for our overall health and well-being. But it's really being sold under this kind of wellness guise on, look and see what's in your gut so you can change things and live your best and happiest, healthiest life. And the science to back the claims that they're making for some of these conditions and changes to potential diet or lifestyle are just not there yet. Could be in the future, but the way it's being marketed and the information that a consumer is getting or a doctor is getting on that, it's just there's no good evidence to show that it's of any benefit.
Sure, and especially claiming that they know what the right levels would be of different numbers of bacteria when we just don't know at the moment. And they're just confidently saying it should be in this level or that level. I mean, sure, there have been cases where fecal transplants have saved lives, and we know that there's whole huge potential, but we really just at the beginning of this journey, like we're on the edge of the ocean. We have no idea what's over the horizon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely.
I had no idea that they were selling that one. What's another test? This will be the 5th one now that they're promoting?
Yeah, so the last one we looked at was the testosterone test. And so this one was really being sold to men who weren't necessarily have low testosterone. They were usually being sold to men within the normal range who might just not be looking or feeling their best, and kind of telling them that, normal isn't good enough. You need to be at these peak levels. You need to get tested now, if you're tired or you're, might have gained a little bit of weight or, things that kind of happen to all of us, I think, but really with this kind of underlying premise that this would then enhance their masculinity or their sexual performance or kind of give them this zest for life to being at this optimal range of their testosterone. And it was really linked to testosterone supplementation, which we know for healthy men that there could be potential dangers to long-term use of testosterone supplementation. And the science just isn't there again to be able to safely say that all men who are healthy and have really no underlying symptoms or conditions should be taking.
And what are the potential bad effects of somebody, say, like me, just suddenly taking big fat doses of testosterone? Would they be cardiovascular or something? Or?
Well, I think that there's still trials going on for that, but the long-term use in terms of cardiovascular health and more morbidity hasn't been established yet. And so there's concerns around that, but there's just general concerns around, if you throw one kind of hormone in one direction, lots of other kind of underlying symptoms or conditions could pop up as well. And it does lead to male infertility as well.
Because I'm making testosterone as a male because I need to keep it at a certain level. But if I'm inputting, how do you take it? Inject it or you swallow it?
Testosterone supplement, I think it can be in different forms.
Okay.
So I think you can inject it. I think you can digest it. I think there's different forms.
So if I take testosterone, that shuts down my natural production of testosterone because my body senses I've already got enough. And you say that can lead to male infertility. Wow, look at all these side effects. Okay, so now we're moving on to where you went looking. So which social media platforms did you go looking on?
So we looked at Instagram and TikTok, and the reason we were interested in those because the tests that we looked at were kind of being targeted at a range of different ages, different genders, and we know that those two platforms are the most fastest growing platforms and have that kind of short form content that is becoming more and more popular.
Sure, in your paper you talk about how they got 1 million, 1.5 million or 2 million views per month, so that's huge. So, okay, those are the platforms. How many posts did you look at in total?
So we looked at almost 1,000 different posts across those 5 medical tests. So there was 100 from each test on each platform, so 200 of each test.
Okay, that's a decent sample size. And with regard to the actual people who did the posting, when you looked at them, what was their potential audience out in the world there?
So they had a potential audience of almost 200 million followers.
Wow.
So it was huge.
That's over 2% of the world's population.
Yeah.
Wow. In just 1,000 little posts. Okay. So these are the people who are doing it and how many people they can reach. So what sort of, can you give us some stats of what you found when you went looking in the papers that I mentioned right at the beginning?
Sure. So I think the main thing we found was that the posts were just utterly misleading. And I think that wasn't surprising for us, to be honest, because we know from other health contexts that have done studies on social media that there is a very high proportion of misinformation that is out there. And so specifically, we were interested in the benefits and the harms and how those are being discussed because we knew all the tests and we specifically picked all the tests that have this potential harm of overdiagnosis as well as other harms. And so what we found was that 87% of the posts mentioned benefits, but only 15% mentioned any potential harms. And often when those harms were mentioned, they were, mentioned very briefly or they were downplayed as well.
Wow. Okay. And then what other stats did you find as well?
So we also found that only 6% of the posts mentioned scientific evidence. So
what? Not 60?
6.
6. Okay, 06, not 60. Okay, right.
Yeah, so 6% mentioned scientific evidence, and those were ones that specifically mentioned a study author or a study name or had the study citation in the text or kind of up on the green screen behind them, but they were explicit mention of some sort of study. We didn't look at whether or not the claims that were being made actually aligned with the evidence, but we wanted to know whether or not they were mentioning it in the first place.
Right. Was there any sort of financial motivation in the background there?
Yeah, definitely. So we found that over 2/3 of the influencers and account holders had a financial interest in discussing the test. And we actually think that that was probably an underestimation because we took a very hardline approach there, looking at explicit financial interest. So people who had mentioned that it was indeed an ad, not that Kim Kardashian did, whether or not they had some sort of sponsorship that was declared, whether or not they were the doctor selling the test, telling you to come in, or had kind of a link that you could click and buy the test. So those were really explicit. So we think that's an underestimation because we know from other studies that often financial disclosures are hidden on social media.
Okay, so you got these stats about various aspects of it. Where do anecdotes fall in this?
Yes, we found that over 1/3 of posts had a personal anecdote or an anecdote about a family or friend that was being used.
1/3, because on one hand, the plural of anecdote is anecdotes, not data, but anecdotes are surprisingly powerful. A family influence. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to think about science or think about benefits and harms of tests and treatment when someone is standing there potentially looking really good, telling you they felt very good or had some really positive experience about using this test. And so it can be really powerful and really play on those emotions that I think we hold strongly in society around early detection, early screening, and kind of being on top of our health and that knowledge is power. And so I think it really used those kind of narratives to pull on people to then go and buy the test.
Well, I do believe that, I could be wrong, but I think Mel Gibson went on to Joe Rogan to talk about some Indian spice being used to cure cancer in 4 people he knew personally, and they weren't named and there was no scientific study. So the anecdote is a very powerful thing in our society.
Absolutely.
Wow. So where do you go from here then?
Where we're going with our next piece of research is really looking at what international and also national regulations exist around social media and what can be discussed.
Virtually none, is there, at the moment? Is that a reasonable
Well, there are
thing?
some that do exist.
Yeah.
But I think we're interested in why the posts that we saw that were so misleading and often were, explicit ads or pieces of, marketing, why they were getting through and what kind of regulations they may or may not comply with. I think it's difficult in a space like social media where we can be sitting here in Australia and some of the posts might comply or not with the national regulations, but if they come from a doctor or someone in the US or the UK, we can still see them and we can still go to our doctor to discuss those, or we can still click a link to buy those things. So we're trying to understand how that kind of works, because we believe that the responsibility shouldn't just be placed on the individual to navigate all these misleading information online. It can be really tricky in a place like social media where there is so much information all the time, in your hand, floating around, to be able to tell a person to kind of figure out whether or not that is misinformation or not. So we're taking that approach, but I also think that individuals can do things as well.
Personally, like what?
So I think we should just be really skeptical of the information that we see on social media in terms of most things, but specifically health and medical information. We probably shouldn't be going there as the first source, but inevitably I think we're going to be fed that information. So just being really skeptical about what we see being discussed and promoted, especially from people who aren't legitimate medical professionals or from accounts that might not be credible health sources. I think we can also think about personally how this test or treatment might be of benefit or of harm to me, and really thinking through kind of the consequences, the costs of that, and just thinking that if it does sound too good to be true, then it probably indeed is.
Well, it is tricky because on one hand it's quite difficult to read a scientific paper. So yours were well written, but even so, it took me 15 minutes to read each one. Whereas social media, 40 seconds, I now know that chlorophyll juice will cure cancer and everything else. So there's that advantage from their point of view with social media being so easy to digest and so quickly absorbable. But then on the other hand, it's not necessarily correct. I read one study which worked on the fact that basically what you see on social media is a reflection to some degree of society. And so on TikTok, 98% of the information on health, nutrition and diet was wrong. But to their credit, TikTok have set up a hashtag STEM where that stuff has been specifically being vetted by people who fact check it. So if you see the hashtag STEM, you can trust that. But there's not that much a person can do. Like critical thinking, as you mentioned, is the last line of defense.
Yeah, and it's really hard to place that responsibility, like I said, on the individual to do that. I think there's also a place for, scientists and medical professionals to be online discussing balanced, evidence-based information as well, much like you do, because, we did see in our study that there were some good posts out there, and they can be popular and they can be viral as well. So I think, even having one reach a small proportion of that kind of 200 million plus is still important in getting some of those more balanced evidence-based messages out there.
I have been reading papers which kind of suggest that social media is more evil than big tobacco, and that's a mighty big claim to make. But if they're knowingly putting forward lies, like I've seen quite a few fake videos of me on social media advertising everything from tinnitus stuff to parasites in your body and erection products, and there's my face and my mouth is saying things and there are words coming out of my voice, and it's been totally made up. And this is on top of the other lies that are going on there. So you've talked to some degree about these social things that with regard to social media, what should kind of be done at a higher level, and also what the individual level can do. But maybe people could become your student and work in this field. How can they follow you and your fine work? And do you in fact take on students for PhD?
Absolutely. Always looking for students.
So how do they find you?
So my academic profile at the University of Sydney is a good way, but I'm also on LinkedIn, Brooke Nickel on LinkedIn.
Wow, look, you're doing the work of the angels here, trying to fight the onslaughts of the forces of evil and the disinformation. Thank you so much for taking us through what you've been looking at and finding.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Brooke. Shirtloads of Science is washed, spun and aired by the University of Sydney.